everybody. Okay, so we are beginning on Unit 8, and we're going to be talking about the autonomic nervous system. So it's a bit complex, but we'll take it one step at a time, and if you just follow along, if you've read the notes, it should make sense to you. So what I have drawn here is the spinal cord right here. So this long tube would just be the spinal cord. We're not thinking about the individual neurons just yet. We're just thinking of the main structures, and we're going to add in all the details in a little bit. But for now, here's our spinal cord. So we'll have axons from the autonomic nervous system coming down the spinal cord. And then they're going to leave the spinal cord, and we'll see exactly how they leave the spinal cord in a few minutes. But they'll leave the spinal cord, and they need to go meet up with their lower motor neuron, which will be in an autonomic ganglia somewhere. So those autonomic ganglia can be in various places. For the sympathetic nervous system, we have sympathetic chain ganglia, which are located on either side of the spinal cord, and they're paired. And I haven't drawn as many as there really are to try to keep this a little bit simple, but there's a lot of them going up and down either side of the spinal cord, and they'd be linked. Because they're on either side of the spinal cord, they're called paravertebral, so next to the vertebra. Now there's also, oops, I forgot to draw in the bottom one down here. There's one single one at the bottom called the ganglion impar, and that is also part of the sympathetic chain ganglia, so it would be connected there at the bottom. Now also part of the sympathetic nervous system, you'll have three ganglia that are sitting in front of the vertebrae, or in front of the spinal cord, and they are called collateral ganglia, and because they're in front of the spinal cord, they're called prevertebral, in front of the vertebrae. So there's three of them, and we'll get to know all three of those in a minute. Now there's also another option, and this would go for both sympathetic system and the parasympathetic system. And that would be ganglia that are out near the target organ or even in the target organ. Those are called terminal ganglia or intrinsic ganglia or intramural ganglia. They're all referring to the same thing. Ganglia that are just very, very close to, if not right on top of, the target organ. So up here we have two of those, the cardiac plexus and the pulmonary plexus. This one dealing obviously with the heart, and this one dealing with the lungs. So these two are up in the thoracic cavity. If we go down below the diaphragm, we end up in these terminal, intrinsic, or intramural ganglia, which are down lower. And that would be the renal plexus, which is on or near the kidneys, and the inferior hypogastric plexus, which is at the very bottom of the body. So to summarize then, these sympathetic chain ganglia are going to have only lower motor neurons for the sympathetic system. The collateral ganglia will have lower motor neurons, again, for the sympathetic system. But these terminal ganglia, whether up here in the thoracic cavity or down here in the abdominal pelvic cavity, those will have lower motor neurons for either sympathetic or parasympathetic. So the idea here is that your upper motor neuron, wherever it's going, let's say it needs to go to the heart. So if it's eventually going to stimulate the heart, it would have to have the upper motor neuron go out to meet up with a lower motor neuron in the cardiac plexus. If we were going down towards the kidneys, say, then the upper motor neuron needs to meet up with the lower motor neuron, which will be here. So we're just looking at pathways, like a relay system of the upper motor neuron, where the lower motor neuron is, how the upper motor neuron gets to the lower motor neuron, etc. So we have to have a connection between the spinal cord and these ganglia. So we're going to see in our next picture some connections, what those are called. They're various nerves, obviously, because they contain axons, and all a nerve is a bunch of axons going to the same place. And we'll have nerves that go to all of these different places. So let's make this picture a little bit more interesting right here. So this is the same picture. I've just drawn those nerves on, those connections, how we connect our spinal cord to these various ganglia. So here's our spinal cord right here. here on either side of the spinal cord, we have our sympathetic chain ganglia. There in front of the spinal cord, those are going to be the collateral ganglia. Now up here in the thoracic cavity, we just have nerves going out to those terminal ganglia, the pulmonary plexus and the cardiac plexus. These are called sympathetic nerves, and they come out of the sympathetic chain ganglia. Down here, we have nerves going down to the terminal ganglia in the abdominopelvic cavity, so the renal plexus and the inferior hypogastric plexus. These nerves that are going to the renal plexus and to the inferior hypogastric plexus, as well as the nerves that are going to the collateral ganglia, are all called splanchnic nerves. So coming out of the sympathetic chain ganglia, you'll have 3 nerves, splanchnic nerves, going to the 3 collateral ganglia. Then you'll have nerves, also splanchnic nerves, going out to the terminal ganglia, to the renal plexus and to the inferior hypogastric plexus. So up above the diaphragm in the thoracic cavity, the nerves going out of the sympathetic chain ganglia to the terminal ganglia are called sympathetic nerves. Down in the abdominopelvic cavity, the nerves coming off of the sympathetic chain ganglia going either to the 3 collateral ganglia or these 2 terminal ganglia, those will be called splanchnic nerves. Now, the splanchnic nerves have names, and they're in order from top to bottom, so they're listed here. The greater splanchnic nerve, the lesser splanchnic nerve, lumbar splanchnic nerve, least splanchnic nerve, sacral splanchnic nerve, and the pelvic splanchnic nerve. So, what are they doing? Where are they going, or what's happening with those splanchnic nerves? They are containing axons for upper motor neurons, and those axons for those upper motor neurons are going to meet up with their lower motor neuron, maybe in the inferior hypogastric plexus, maybe in one of these collateral ganglia. Now, for these collateral ganglia, the collateral ganglia also have names. The top one is called the Celiac Ganglion. The second one is called the superior mesenteric ganglion, and the very bottommost one is the inferior mesenteric ganglion. What this means, the Celiac Ganglion. If you think of where you may have heard the word celiac before, like celiac disease, it has to do with digestion and especially the upper digestive tract, your stomach and a little bit of your duodenum, so the first part of the small intestine. So this is dealing with essentially the uppermost parts of your digestive system. Superior mesenteric, the word mesenteric, mesenteries, makes you think of intestines. Superior means above, so the higher parts of the intestines, the small intestine, a little bit of the large intestine, the part that's up higher in the abdominopelvic cavity. That's what we're dealing with there. And then the inferior mesenteric, again intestines, but the lower part, so going down deeper into the bottom of the small intestine or into the large intestine. So if you think of this here, we've got axons for the upper motor neurons coming in through the splanchnic nerves. They meet up with the lower motor neuron that's sitting there, what I'm pointing to is the inferior mesenteric ganglion. And that's where you'll find that lower motor neuron, which will then go out towards your large intestine, say. Okay, so what that means then. Number 1, so we have our celiac ganglion. This is the greater splanchnic nerve going to the celiac ganglion. So this is dealing with like your stomach, upper digestive tract. This one, the second splanchnic nerve, it's going to the superior mesenteric ganglion, so small intestines. So like the upper regions of that. The third one, letter C, that's the lumbar splanchnic nerve. It's going to the inferior mesenteric ganglion. So that's dealing with the large intestines and the lower parts of the small intestines. The next one, the least splanchnic nerve, That's this one. This is going over to the renal plexus, dealing with the kidneys. And then finally, or not finally for the sympathetic system, I should say, we have this one. This is the sacral splanchnic nerve. That's going to the inferior hypogastric plexus. That deals with things like the bladder and the rectum. So all of these will have sympathetic upper motor neurons. This last splanchnic nerve here, the pelvic splanchnic nerve, this is only parasympathetic. It's also going to the inferior hypogastric plexus, so it's dealing with the same things, but as the sacral splanchnic nerve, but just in a parasympathetic sort of way. Okay, so for our next video, we're going to talk about how we get the upper motor axon to the sympathetic chain ganglion. So we'll be looking at a close-up of the spinal cord, and then we'll follow a splanchnic nerve. We'll just choose one splanchnic nerve and follow it out to its collateral ganglion. So we really see the pathway that these axons are going to take to the sympathetic chain ganglion, and then where they go from there. Okay, so we'll pick up on the next video with that.